Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Button, Uncanny Stories by Richard Matheson. Now, before I get into this review, I just want to give a little shout out to a guy here on YouTube named Esley, who goes by the name Entertainment Fanatic Reviews here on YouTube. I recently contributed to one of his videos. It was a video on 5 horror remakes that are better than the original. So definitely check out that guy's channel and check out the video I was in. I'll leave a link to both of those in the description below. Now, this is a collection of different short stories by Richard Matheson. Now, the collection itself was published in 2008. However, all the stories in here were originally published decades earlier in different literary magazines. Most of the stories in here were actually published in the 50s and 60s. Now, Richard Matheson is also the author of books like I Am Legend, What Dreams May Come, Hell House, The Shrinking Man, and A Stir of Echoes. He also wrote some of the most famous episodes of The Twilight Zone. Now, in this video, I'll be reviewing each individual story from the collection. So, the first story featured in this book is Button, which of course is the title of the entire collection. Now, Button was originally published in 1970, and this is about this couple, this husband and wife, who are kind of low income. They live in this small apartment, and they both have to work to support themselves. And then one day, the wife finds this box outside her apartment with a note addressed to her and her husband. The box is sort of like a button unit, and later on they get a visit from this man who calls himself Mr. Stewart, and he says that if you press this button, you'll get $50,000. However, somebody that you don't know will die. And in the story, the husband is like, fuck this shit, we're not murdering somebody for money. And then the wife is like, well, we don't know them. And the whole point of the story is really what greed does to people, and will you sacrifice your own morals and your own personal dignity for money, and will you essentially sell your soul for a chance to have a better life? And the story definitely has some elements of the Faust legend. Like, it almost feels like a sell your soul to the devil kind of story. Like, you could even interpret Mr. Stewart as an incarnation of Satan. Now, Button I thought was a great story. It's a really good morality tale, and I also feel class is kind of a theme within this story. Like, at one point in the story, the husband is trying to convince the wife that if she pushes this button, it will be murder, and then she's like, well, what if it's some Chinese peasant or some diseased native from the Congo? And what she says kind of makes this character irredeemable, in my opinion, because basically it shows that she feels that the life of somebody of a lower status in society than her has less value than her life. And of course, this woman is willing to murder somebody just so she could have a higher status. So I definitely feel like class and privilege are major themes within this story. Now, this story was adapted into an episode of the 80s Twilight Zone series, which I absolutely loved that series. I think the 80s Twilight Zone is one of the most underrated shows ever made. Sure, it could never hold a candle to the original Twilight Zone, but that show did a really good job at being its own thing. Now, as much as I love that show, I have to admit the episode that this story was adapted into is not one of the better episodes of the 80s Twilight Zone, at least not in my opinion. This story was also adapted into a 2009 film called The Box with Cameron Diaz, which was directed by Richard Kelly, who also directed Donnie Darko. I've never seen that movie, but I've heard nothing but bad things about it. Now, because of that movie, this collection was actually reprinted under the title The Box. Now, Stephen King and Richard Chizmar did a book called Gwendy's Button Box, which actually has a lot of similar ideas to this story. The second story featured in this collection is called Girl of My Dreams, and this was originally published in 1963. The story is about this guy whose girlfriend has premonitions. She could see how and when somebody is going to die, and since this guy's a scumbag, he uses this to his advantage where he goes to some of these people that his girlfriend predicts are going to die, and he says, hey, I could tell you how and when you're going to die and how to prevent your death. All you have to do is give me X amount of money. So in the story, this guy's girlfriend has a premonition that this little boy is going to get hit by a car, so they go to the boy's mother saying, hey, give us 10 grand and we'll tell you how to prevent your son's death. The issue is, can this woman pay it? But this is an excellent story, and the main character of this story, you fucking hate this motherfucker. And without giving too much away, he does get a good comeuppance by the end of the story. I do think it's kind of funny that the girlfriend in this story who has psychic powers, her name is Carrie, and this was written a good 11 years before Stephen King's Carrie. It does make me wonder if maybe Stephen King took some inspiration from this story, which wouldn't surprise me because Stephen King has said that Richard Matheson was one of his biggest influences. The third story featured in this collection is called Dying Room Only, and this was originally published in 1953, and this is about this couple who come to this cafe in the middle of nowhere, and the service there sucks, and the employees treating them very rudely. And then they end up using the restrooms. The wife obviously goes to the woman's room, and the husband goes to the men's room. When she comes out, she sees that her husband is not there. At first, she thinks that he's still in the bathroom, but when she sees that he's not coming out, she starts to get really worried, and soon it becomes apparent that he's not in the restroom at all. It appears that her husband just disappeared without a trace, and she starts to think that the people in the cafe did something to her husband. But this was another really good story, and something that actually kind of surprised me about this story is it's actually a pretty straightforward crime thriller. And the reason that surprised me is because the way the story was going, I was kind of expecting the story to have sort of a Twilight Zone-esque kind of twist to it, and it really doesn't. It's actually a pretty simple suspense story, but I thought it was really good. Now, this story was adapted into a 1973 made-for-TV movie of the same name. The next story featured in the collection is A Flourish of Strumpets, and this was originally published in 1956. And while Richard Matheson was primarily known for horror and science fiction, this story is actually a comedy or a satire. And the story really is freaking hilarious. It's about this husband and wife who every night these prostitutes come to their door. It turns out that there's sort of a door-to-door escort service. And they're both outraged by it, but the wife might be a little more outraged than the husband. And they try telling the police about it, but the police aren't really doing anything, and it's very much implied that the police are using this service. And the husband tells his friend about it, and his friend's like, what's the big deal? I use this service all the time. And no matter what they do, these prostitutes will not leave them alone. Now, because this story was published in the 50s, which was a very conservative time, you could say that Matheson is making a satire on the prudishness of society, or it could be the exact opposite. Maybe the story is actually a warning saying, hey, if we abandon our morals, this is where society could go. Either way, it's a very, very funny story. The next story featured in this collection is No Such Thing as a Vampire, and this was originally published in 1959. This story is set in the 19th century, and it's about this man whose wife is being terrorized by a vampire. Like, every night a vampire comes to her room and drains her of her blood. It's a really interesting story, and there is a twist in the story where it turns out things were not as they appeared to be. But this is another excellent story, and I highly recommend it if you get this collection. Now, in 1968, this story was adapted into an episode of a show called Late Night Horror, which I think was a BBC series. The story was adapted again into one of the segments of a made-for-TV anthology film called Dead of Night. The next story featured in this collection is called Pattern for Survival, and this was originally published in 1955, and to be honest, this is probably my least favorite story in the collection. I just didn't really get this one. Maybe I would have to reread it, but it's about an author who writes this series of books, and everybody you're introduced to in the story absolutely loves this author's books. And that's really it. There is sort of a twist in the story, and I think I understand what the twist was going for, but overall, I just didn't really get this story. Maybe I'm the problem, maybe I'm just a dumbass, but I didn't really understand this story, so this is my least favorite. The next story featured in the collection is Mute, which was originally published in 1962, and this and the next one are probably my two favorites in this collection. This is also the longest story in the collection. This is actually close to being a novella, but in the story there's this couple who are originally from Europe, and they have a 7-year-old son who they never taught how to speak. And as the story goes on, you start to realize why they never taught him how to speak. But they're killed in a house fire in the beginning of the story, so the sheriff of this town, him and his wife end up taking this little boy in. And throughout the story, they try to teach the boy how to speak, and as it goes on, you start to realize why teaching this boy how to speak is actually taking something away from him. But this story is actually a really interesting exploration on the importance of language, but also how not everybody interprets language in the same way. But it's also a really sweet and moving story about the relationship between this little boy and the sheriff's wife, who starts to develop a real affection for him because it turns out that their son died a few years prior to the events of this story. But I highly recommend the story Mute. Now, this was adapted into an episode of The Twilight Zone. I've never seen that Twilight Zone episode. All I know about it is in the episode, it's a little girl instead of a little boy. The next story featured in this collection is The Creeping Terror, which also goes by the title A Touch of Grapefruit. And this was originally published in 1959, and this is very much a satire. The story is written as if it's an academic essay about a certain event that's been happening in America for a few decades. And basically the premise of the story is Los Angeles is alive and is spreading. Basically the whole idea is, what if Los Angeles was literally a virus? Like, people start acting like they're living in LA, and certain plants that typically grow in California start growing in places they've never grown before. And within the course of a few decades, half the country falls to Los Angeles. And this story was freaking hilarious. Like, yes, the events that are happening are taken seriously in context of the story, but the story is very much a satire. And this is my second favorite story in the collection. The next story featured in this collection is Shockwave, and this was originally published in 1963, and this is probably my second least favorite story in the collection. I'm sorry, but this story really didn't do anything for me. Basically, the story is about this organ player at this church who believes that the organ is alive. That's really it. This story didn't do anything for me personally. The next story in here is Clothes Make the Man, and this was originally published in 1950. This is another very satirical story. Basically, the story follows an unnamed narrator who is at a bar, and this guy comes up to him who starts talking about how his brother is no longer a man. It all began when somebody misplaced his brother's hat, and all of a sudden he couldn't talk or think. And as the story goes on, you find out that this guy's clothes somehow developed a mind of its own. And this guy can't function without his clothes. This was a very funny little story. The next story featured in this collection is The Jazz Machine, and this was originally published in 1962. This one's interesting because it's written almost like a poem or like a jazz song, but the story is told from the point of view of a jazz musician who meets this guy who claims that he made a machine that could play jazz better than any jazz player could play. What makes this story really interesting is there's a lot of racial subtext. The main character is a black man, which I thought was really interesting because this was published in 1962 and was written by a white guy. The whole point of the story is that jazz is something that was made by the African American community, and now this white guy comes along with a machine that could apparently play jazz better than they can. So the main character of the story is like telling this white man, so you're gonna take that from us too? Again, what's so interesting about the story is it was published in the 60s, and it's touching on these themes of racism, yet Richard Matheson was a white man. The only critique you could have about it is the main character you could accuse of being a little stereotypical, but still, I thought The Jazz Machine was a very good story. The final story collected in here is 'Tis the Season to be Jelly, and this was originally published in 1963. The story is set after some event has happened that is causing the human race to literally dissolve. And the story follows this family who are literally falling apart. Like, the opening line is, Pa's nose fell off at breakfast. It fell right into Ma's coffee and displaced it. And at the end of the story, one of the characters has his leg fall off. But despite the fact that they're dissolving, this family is still trying to get on with their lives. It's a very darkly funny story, but the story has kind of an abstract writing style because a lot of it's written as these characters would talk, and a lot of the characters talk in sort of broken English. But it's an interesting story. I would definitely recommend it. So yeah, that was my review on Button Button Uncanny Stories by Richard Matheson. I would definitely recommend getting this collection, and bye.